The restaurant glimmered like money. Gold chandeliers, velvet booths, and voices dipped in arrogance. Billionaire Ethan Reynolds sat at the center table, his laughter smooth and cruel. He didn't lower his tone when the waitress arrived, a beautiful black woman named Keisha Williams, 28, dark skin glowing under soft light. As she placed a scotch on the table, he smirked and spoke in German, his words slicing the air. "They'll hire anyone now, even from the Bronx." The man at his table chuckled. Keisha understood every word. Her jaw tightened, but her hand stayed steady. If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this are still happening and the world needs to hear them. She didn't flinch, didn't let them see how it burned. She had served men like him before, men who thought money made them untouchable. Ethan leaned back, impressed by her silence. "Oh, she's disciplined," he said to his friends. "Maybe that's why they like hiring her kind." The laughter returned, quiet but sharp. Then his hand moved too wide, spilling the drink across her clean white apron. Amber liquid dripped onto the floor. He didn't apologize. He just reached into his pocket, flicked a few bills onto the table, and said, "For dry cleaning." The group laughed louder. Keisha stared at the money, the way it lay like an insult. Then, slowly, she picked up the wet napkin first, then the cash, folding both without a word. She didn't thank him. Ethan smirked. "You're welcome." The manager looked away. Other staff did too. That's how humiliation spreads, through silence. Keisha turned and walked back to the kitchen, her back straight, eyes glassy but proud. Inside the kitchen's heat, the clang of pans drowned the sound of her breaking heart. She pressed her palms on the counter, breathing deep, whispering to herself, "Don't cry here. Not here." Her co-worker Talia glanced over. "You good?" Keisha forced a smile. "Yeah, just spilled drink. Nothing new." But her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of always having to stay calm. The next morning, Keisha Williams stood in her small Bronx apartment, buttoning a clean white shirt. The city's hum seeped to the cracked window, mixed with the distant sirens that never stopped. Her reflection in the mirror showed calm, but her eyes told another story, tired, guarded, and brave. She glanced at the couch where her mother, Lucille, rested beneath a quilt, the morning light brushing her silver hair. A faint wheeze came with every breath. Keisha moved quietly to set a cup of tea beside her, whispering, "Morning, Mama. I'm heading to work early." Lucille stirred. "You don't have to go in today." Keisha smiled gently. "Rent doesn't wait. Mama, you know that." She tried not to look at the pile of envelopes on the kitchen table. Hospital bills, overdue notices, and one marked final warning. On the wall, above their old TV, hung a faded photo of her father. He'd been a schoolteacher, a man who believed in the power of words. His handwriting still lived inside the notebook Keisha carried in her bag. On its first page, in neat ink, he'd written, "Words don't need a shout to change a room." She whispered those words every morning before work. They steadied her, a quiet kind of armor. 8 years ago, Keisha had been a scholarship student at NYU, majoring in linguistics. She spoke 4 languages, English, German, French, and Spanish. Her professors once called her a voice made for diplomacy. But that future had collapsed overnight when her thesis was accused of plagiarism, a false claim she never got to fight. The expulsion had crushed her dream and her father's pride. And 3 weeks later, her mother's first stroke hit. Now, at 28, she worked 12-hour shifts at Silver Slate, serving wine to men who never learned of respect, men like Ethan Reynolds. As she packed her lunch, a single apple and leftover rice, she caught herself staring at the apron hanging by the door, still faintly stained with last night's scotch. Her stomach tightened. She took a deep breath. "You don't get to break me twice," she whispered, tying her hair back. It was the following evening when Keisha walked back into Silver Slate. The scent of roasted garlic filled the air, the clinking of crystal glasses echoing across the polished marble. She tied her apron tighter, her eyes scanning the reservation chart. And there was again Table 7, Ethan Reynolds. Her pulse slowed, not from fear, but from a memory of last night's laughter. She had promised herself he wouldn't break her twice. At 7:15 p.m., Ethan entered, alone this time. His watch gleamed under the chandelier. He walked in like the restaurant belonged to him, and in a way it did. His money paid for silence here. "Good evening, Mr. Reynolds," she said evenly. He looked up, half smile already forming. "Ah, my favorite waitress. Did they at least cover your dry cleaning?" The words landed like a slap, but Keisha didn't blink. "It came out fine," she replied, her voice calm as glass. Ethan chuckled. "You've got composure. Most people would have quit." "I'm not most people," she said, refilling his water. As she turned to leave, he added softly, "They say the Bronx makes people tough. Guess that's true." Keisha froze for half a breath, then kept walking. Behind the counter, Talia whispered, "He's back again? What's his deal?" Keisha shrugged. "Some men test limits because they think we won't push back." The dinner rush blurred around her. Orders shouted, silverware clinking, but every time she passed Ethan's table, she felt his gaze. He wasn't eating. He was observing, waiting for a reaction. By dessert, he spoke again, leaning back. "You ever think about doing something better than this?" Keisha looked him dead in the eye. "Every day." He smirked. "Figures. But life doesn't change just because you dream louder." She replied quietly, "Sometimes it does when you finally speak." That line stopped him for a split second. She saw it, the flicker of confusion in his pale blue eyes, before he masked it with a grin. When the night ended, Ethan left a 100 bill on the table again. Keisha glanced at it, then turned away. If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe. Rain tapped against the tall restaurant windows at evening, soft but constant. The dinner rush had begun. Waiters moved in rhythm, the sound of glass and silver filling the room. Keisha Williams adjusted her apron, scanning the tables. Then she saw him again. Ethan Reynolds, table 7. Alone. He didn't smile this time, just raised a hand slightly, as if summoning her. Keisha walked over, posture calm, eyes steady. "Good evening, Mr. Reynolds," she said. He leaned back. "You're consistent. That's good. Would you like to order?" He ignored the menu. "You speak German, don't you?" The question froze her mid-step. Ethan's lips curved. "Last night you reacted just enough. I'm guessing you understood every word." "I did," she replied quietly. He grinned. "Say something in German. Entertain me." Keisha stared at him for a moment. The air around the table thickened. Every waiter nearby slowed down, pretending not to listen. Ethan's tone dripped with condescension, but underneath it was challenge, a belief that she'd stay silent again. Keisha placed his glass of red wine gently on the table. "Language is entertainment," she said softly. Ethan chuckled. "Everything's entertainment when you're the one paying." That was the moment it broke, the barrier between silence and self-respect. Keisha leaned forward slightly, her voice firm but composed. In fluent, elegant German, she said, "Respekt ist auch eine Sprache, aber nicht jeder lernt sie." Respect is a language too, but not everyone learns it. The words cut through the room like lightning. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks froze midair. Even the background music seemed to fade. Ethan blinked, confusion flickering into embarrassment as nearby diners turned to look. He tried to laugh, but it came out uneven. "Cute," he said, forcing a smile. "You rehearsed that?" "No," Keisha replied calmly. "I lived it." Her tone wasn't loud, yet every corner of the restaurant heard it. Ethan's smirk faltered. His power, the invisible wall he carried everywhere, cracked in front of a woman he thought beneath him. Without waiting for his reply, Keisha straightened a napkin on the table, turned and walked away. Phones were already out. Someone whispered, "Did you hear that?" She spoke perfect German. Back inside the service station, Talia rushed over. "Girl, what did you just say?" "Everyone's whispering." Keisha exhaled slowly, her hands trembling from adrenaline. "I just told him the truth." By the next morning, the internet had done what it always does. Turned whispers into thunder. A short, shaky video recorded from Table 9 had gone viral overnight. The caption read, "Billionaire mocks black waitress in German. Gets schooled fluently on respect." Within 12 hours, the clip had crossed 3 million views. Comment sections flooded with outrage, support, and disbelief. The hashtag trended across the US, UK, and Canada. Keisha Williams hadn't even seen it yet. She was on the subway, half asleep, clutching her father's notebook. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. Messages, missed calls, unknown numbers. She ignored them until Talia texted, "Girl, you're on the news." At first, Keisha thought it was a joke. But when she opened her screen, her heart skipped. There she was, frozen mid-sentence, speaking German with calm authority, her face lit by candlelight in defiance. The clip had been edited with subtitles, slow zooms, dramatic captions. And the comments, thousands of them, were cheering for her. That woman is class. She handled it like a queen. This is how you fight racism, with grace. Keisha's stop arrived, but she didn't move. For the first time, her silence had been seen. By noon, journalists were calling Silver Slate, asking for statements. Ethan Reynolds' name trended alongside hers. The words "racist billionaire" topped Google search. His company stock had already dipped by 5. Inside the restaurant, tension was thick. The manager, Johnny, pulled Keisha aside before her shift. "Corporate's freaking out," he muttered. "Reporters called 3 times. They want to know if you plan to, sue." "Sue?" Keisha repeated. "For what?" "For being humiliated in public." Johnny sighed. "I'm just saying, maybe lay low. Don't talk to anyone." Keisha smiled faintly. "That's what I've been doing my whole life." At home that evening, her mother was watching the video on an old laptop. Tears shimmered in her eyes. "That's my daughter," she whispered. "You didn't shout. You stood tall." Keisha sat beside her, finally letting herself smile. "I just spoke," she said softly, "and people listened." Later that night, she received an email from an unfamiliar address, the Academic Review Office, NYU. Subject line, "Case Reassessment, Maya Williams." Her breath caught. The file they once buried was back in motion. The next few days turned New York into a storm of flashing headlines and collapsing reputations. Ethan Reynolds, the man who once thought himself untouchable, was now the symbol of arrogance exposed. News anchors replayed the viral clip on loop. Keisha's calm German words echoing over slow-motion replays. Respect is a language too, but not everyone learns it. Sponsors pulled back from Ethan's companies. 2 major boards announced temporary suspensions. Online petitions demanded his public apology. Every time he tried to issue a statement, the internet reminded him, "You can't buy dignity." Meanwhile, Keisha Williams became a name people couldn't forget. Reporters waited outside her apartment building. Strangers sent her flowers. Universities reached out for interviews. She stayed quiet, not out of fear this time, but focus. On the 4th morning, she opened her inbox and froze. The subject line read, "Formal apology and reinstatement offer, NYU Linguistics Department." Her hands shook as she opened it. "After review of your academic record, we acknowledge that the actions taken against you were unjust and unsupported by evidence. We invite you to return as a guest lecturer and complete your degree." Keisha covered her mouth, tears forming. Her mother, sitting nearby, looked up from her knitting. "What's wrong, baby?" Keisha handed her the screen silently. Lucille read it slowly, eyes widening. "They made it, right?" Keisha nodded, voice trembling. They finally listened. That evening, she stood in front of her mirror, same reflection, new energy. The woman who used to whisper now carried weight in every breath. At Silver Slate, the whispers had shifted too. Co-workers who once stayed silent now looked at her with pride. Even Johnny, the manager, said quietly, "You did what most of us never could." Keisha smiled. "I didn't plan to. I just couldn't stay quiet anymore." Across town, Ethan sat in his glass office, reporters waiting outside. He replayed the viral video again, her voice steady, his arrogance exposed. The man who had mocked a waitress was now the lesson in humility the world needed. The cafe was quiet that morning, sunlight spilling across polished tables, the hum of conversation distant. Keisha Williams sat in the back booth, hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea. She wasn't nervous. She was centered. The woman who once whispered now had the world listening. The door opened, and Ethan Reynolds walked in. No entourage, no arrogance, just a tired man stripped of power. His once perfect suit looked ordinary now. He spotted her, hesitated, then approached. "Thank you for meeting me," he said quietly. Keisha looked up, eyes steady. "I'm not here for closure. I already have that." "I know," he said, "but I owe you an apology." For the first time, Ethan didn't sound rehearsed. His voice cracked slightly. "What I did was cruel, not just to you, but to everyone watching who thought money meant permission. I was wrong." Keisha studied him for a long second, then asked, "Do you even understand why it mattered?" He nodded. "Because power means nothing if it silences others. You showed me that." She leaned back. "You can't fix what's broken with guilt or a donation." "I'm not trying to buy forgiveness," Ethan said softly. "I started something new, a scholarship fund for students like you, for those who lost their voice because of people like me. It's called the Dignity Project." Keisha blinked, not from surprise, but from the weight of what that meant. "Then make sure it's more than a headline. Make it real." "It will be," he said, "if you'll help lead it." She smiled faintly. "I'll help build it, but not for you, for them." He nodded, a man who finally understood that humility was louder than power. That evening, Keisha returned home to find her mother knitting by the window, a small smile on her face. "You met him?" Lucille asked. "I did." "Did he listen?" Keisha poured 2 cups of tea and nodded. "For once, yes." Outside, New York pulsed with noise and light, but inside, silence felt holy, the kind earned after every battle worth fighting. If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice is power. Use it.